First there was hip flexion, then there was hip extension, and in the concluding part of the hip movement trilogy there is hip hyperextension. But is your part 3 as strong as the others? Or do you ignore it as a despised monstrosity that you can't face thinking about? Hip hyperextension is where you take the hip in neutral and put the foot back behind the body. The normal range is 10 to 20 degrees, but there are some that have far more, but most that have far less. So here are 9 reasons why it's important. 1. Well, without it, you'd walk around like you soiled yourself. Now, before you start thinking it, you walk around just fine, so hip hyperextension is a non-issue for you. Just remember this. In the same way that when you run out of hip flexion, you get lumbar flexion, aka the butt wink. When you run out of hip hyperextension, you get lumbar extension. And what's bad for the stoat is bad for the other stoats. So if you're walking around extending through your lumbars and creating wild shearing forces, you might want to consider a change. Okay, but if you're Professor X, walking around's no biggie. So what else do you get? 2. If you pray at the altar of ATG because you're all about full range of movement, do you really want to be accused of cherry picking full range of hip movement when it suits your purposes, but ignoring it when it doesn't? However, hip hyperextension is not just there for consistency, it's got some magical properties as well. 3. In the same way that if you do too much bench and not enough row, your shoulders round forward, giving you that gorilla look, which eventually means you can't bench because your shoulders hurt. If you do too much weighted hip flexion and too little weighted hip hyperextension, your hips get tighter and tighter, making it more difficult to squat to depth without pain. 4. If you want to have top speed, that comes from either bouncing off your calves and overstraining your Achilles, or developing and strengthening your hip hyperextension, which means that in the short amount of time that you're on the floor, you can get enough push horizontally backwards. 5. If you ladies don't want the masculine man glute look from squat, 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 where you're big at the bottom but not at the sides and top, then you need hip hyperextension, preferably one-footed. 6. If you're struggling to get into front or front-side splits, no matter how much you stretch, strengthen your hip hyperextension and you'll see that will really help. 7. If you're suffering from hyperlordosing and your back's continually tight, this will help you practice keeping your pelvis neutral while you hyperextend through the hip. This saves your lumbar discs and trips to the chiro. Other chiro. 8. If you've got a weak low ab, carefully doing hip hyperextension with a neutral pelvis will reactivate the low ab and give you a flatter waist. 9. If you have tight and short hip flexors, this sends a neural message to the hip flexor complex to down-regulate tension and lengthen back out, along with massage and stretching. So don't leave hip hyperextension standing in the cold and peering through the window like a chump, while hip flexion and extension are grabbing up all the party food in the warm indoors, because that's how you create a movement pattern serial killer. And it will come back eventually and slay your back, your belly, your performance, and your booty. Not really, but it might, so watch out. For more videos, check out these, and if you like my vibe, please subscribe. Woo! Woo!